Let me start by saying that this is not going to be an unbiased video. I'll go into the reasons why shortly, but if you're looking for an objective review, you should check out my other videos. Wait, never mind, there aren't any. My goal here is to instead explain a more complex impression that this game left me with, both to the viewers of this video and to myself. Because after replaying it 1 year after its release, it took me a while to come to the conclusion that Shin Megami Tensei 5 was probably the best RPG I played last year, but somehow it was still pretty disappointing. Even if you've never played this game, one specific thing about it might have crossed your radar. IGN reviews are prone to backlash from established communities, just ask Pokemon fans, but their review for SMTV is beyond anything I've ever seen from them. The reviewer was rightly eviscerated for constantly comparing the game to Persona 5 and listing the idea of not being like Persona 5 as a flaw or a negative. The purpose of bringing this up is to acknowledge how much expectations can shape your view of a game, because that's effectively what I'm going to be spending the next 10 minutes explaining. I don't think it's wrong to compare this game to Persona 5, considering it's an SMT spin-off and an immensely popular title. But I do think as a reviewer, you also need to take into account the predecessors within the main series itself, including the one that literally released a remaster earlier in the same year. Holy fuck, how did you not mention this once? All of this is to say that I'm going to be guilty of a lot of the same comparisons, because I hold both Persona 5 and Shin Megami Tensei 4 to be among the best games I've ever played, and it's impossible for me to view SMTV outside of that shadow. Take this to be a bit of a spoiler warning. I'll only be including footage from the first half of each title I'm referencing, and I'll avoid specific story spoilers. That being said, it should be known that I'm going to talk a bit about SMT4, and that game has a pretty substantial early game twist. It occurs about 2 hours into the game, and I can't really dance around it. If you can track it down, I recommend playing it, as long as you can stomach graphics that look like someone puked on a PlayStation 1. Also, I haven't been able to think of a good shortening of SMTV, so if it sounds like I'm dying inside every time I have to fire off 4 syllables to reference back, it's because I probably am. SMTV opens in a way that can be misleading for new players. You open in a high school setting, quickly meet like 4 or 5 named characters, and away you go. If you aren't familiar with the series, you'll likely see this section as perhaps setting up something important or introducing key players, but I can't stress enough how little any of this means. Aside from allowing fans pre-release to place bets on which character is going to end up personifying which alignment, the only real purpose of this section is to give a brief glimpse of a relatively normal world before everything becomes very much not normal. About 10 minutes into the game and you're already thrust into a barren landscape with little direction outside of the proto-demon who noticed that you were a Shin Megami Tensei protagonist and immediately merged with you to turn into a K-pop superstar. It's here where SMTV makes its new direction abundantly clear. This is a game about exploration, but it's not the type of exploration from previous SMT titles. Those games were sort of mid-apocalyptic rather than post-apocalyptic, allowing you to explore a vaguely recognizable world now inhabited by ghosts or weiner demons. In this sense, it was the contrast between the normal and the abnormal that provided a unique sense of atmosphere, especially in SMT4. Here you're thrust into what is essentially a desert. There are your standard destroyed buildings and roads peppering the landscape, but it's a much more open area to wander around in, and it leads to a feeling of pseudo-calmness. There isn't as much contrast in the world. It's pretty uniform, to be honest, and it actually works somewhat in the game's favor. The game, in particular the first area, is absolutely gorgeous visually, and seems to be taking a lot of inspiration from titles like Journey and how it focuses on smooth movement through beautiful terrain. It's a weird sensation to get from an SMT game, but it works really well to make the game immediately distinct. Moving along the first area, you're thrust into the various mechanics on offer. Loot and collectibles to find in the world, demons to fight and recruit, big tentacled things to fight in order to clear map fog, and quests you can pick up from NPC demons that range from standard fetch quests to go steal an egg from a giant bird god so I can make an omelet. While this may sound like the game is moving towards somewhat open world design, it's closer to a sort of halfway point. The areas are visually very open, but they tend to be somewhat linear in how you move through them. I liked the sense of forward momentum throughout the world. You don't really get anything from grinding, so you're meant to keep moving to get to the next objective. In the world you can dot small HP and MP restores on paths to keep you moving. The further you get, the more you'll get into a rhythm of clearing out the map fog, wandering around the clear area to grab loot and recruit a few demons, and then moving right along. And again, I have to stress how good this all looks from an art direction standpoint. On top of the environment just being incredibly pleasing to look at in this early stage, there's also the demons themselves, no longer represented by weird blobs or random encounters, but by actually just existing. There's a weird Pokemon Snap style enjoyment on just watching these things run around throughout the world, seeing how their animations change when they spot you and move into fight. And as far as those fights go, I don't really have anything negative to say. The press turn system remains one of the best turn-based systems out there. You're rewarded for targeting weaknesses or critical hits with extra turns, and you can plan out passes to get another attack on a specific character. It meshes well with demon recruiting and fusing mechanics that reward you for keeping a varied party that can handle any situation. If I have anything negative to say about it, it's that it follows the same general flow of previous titles to a sometimes predictable degree. Early on, you'll use basically whatever you can get to exploit weaknesses. Around the mid-game, you'll start to be able to specialize demons in specific elements. And once you hit the late game, it becomes more about stacking buffs and debuffs. While this can feel samey at times, it's still a pretty fun and effective gameplay loop. If it sounds like I'm just sort of zooming through explaining the battle system, it's because I am. It seems like combat is a bit less of a focus than previous titles, primarily because you can actually avoid encounters. There's a few other things worth mentioning, like how it's not quite as difficult as previous installments and it can feel a bit slow at times, but it's just generally a good combat system. I should also probably mention the in-battle animations are stellar and do a great job of lending every demon a unique sense of identity. And honestly, if you've never played this title and were interested in giving it a go, the basic breakdown kind of ends there. Despite the direction this video is about to take, I generally do recommend this game. It's visually brilliant on basically every level, has great combat, a unique sense of style, a unique atmosphere, and the story kinda sucks. There's a reason I used the word disappointing earlier instead of bad, because looking at this game outside of my own bias, I can't deny its quality. But now it's time to talk about that bias. I want to talk about this game in two ways. First, where it struggles and what it's trying to do, and second, why I don't enjoy what it's trying to do as much as previous titles. Let's start with the simplest aspect. The story is fucking atrocious. I think a lot of people will argue that stories have always been bad in SMT games, and it's absolutely true that the games focus more on atmosphere than traditional storytelling, but it doesn't really excuse how bad it is in this game. The game is separated into 4 acts, and there's effectively no connecting through line between them. Each new act basically resets everything and starts something new without really giving weight to anything that's happened before. It's impossible to avoid the impression that the game is just sort of twiddling its thumbs until it gets to the end when it broaches the same law-neutral chaos subjects the series is known for. And on the topic of emulating previous installments, SMTV also seems to struggle with incorporating a few old elements that don't fit with the new exploration focus. There's a lot of minor nitpicks I could point out here, but I think the two biggest examples are the penalty for death and the music. In past games, penalties for falling in battle seemed catered towards what the game was offering. SMT4 allowed you to save at any time and used this opportunity to ramp up the challenge considerably. Sometimes it brushed up against unfair, and other times it zoomed straight past unfair into rage-inducing. Still, you always had the opportunity to respawn for money if you hadn't saved in a while, which functioned as sort of an auto-save system that the game was taxing you to use. In SMT3, you were kicked back to the title screen, but it worked to fit the game's sort of oppressive atmosphere. Losing was part of the experience there, and it made sense. Here you're once again kicked to the starting screen on death, but I'm genuinely not sure why this is. The atmosphere is clearly not going for oppressive in the same way SMT3 was, and moreover, you have to consider what sort of content you have to repeat. This is a generally open game focused on exploration, diving into new areas in the open environments, and grabbing the collectibles, loot, and wiener demons within. The game gains absolutely nothing, and in fact detracts from itself by making you repeat this content. Running through a new part of an area is really enjoyable the first time because you're not sure what to expect and the visuals are novel. Running through it a second time absolutely murders the pacing and turns the most interesting aspect of the game into tedium. The music in this game is actually pretty great, but it's again something that feels like the game is borrowing its identity from previous installments. The differences in music between SMT3 and 4 were staggering and served to really stress the game's atmospheric differences. Nocturne consisted of this weird grunge sound that included muffled screaming, and even as confusing as that sounds, I'm probably not doing the sheer weirdness of it justice. SMT4 had a more laid-back soundtrack, especially when exploring. I'll never really forget the first time you reach the Tokyo map, and the music sort of greets you in this almost welcoming way that subconsciously makes you feel at home after spending the beginning of the game in a very foreign environment. SMTV can match its atmosphere in parts too, especially early in the game with very subdued, creepy music accompanying the first major zone. But in too many instances, it feels like it's just repackaging a lot of the same sorts of songs as SMT4, despite being a vastly different experience. The music can sometimes struggle to match the situations it's used in and can very often just sound like it belongs in a different title altogether. In fact, there's an inconsistency in presentation that sort of permeates throughout the entire game. This is where the comparisons to Persona 5 sort of jump to my mind, because even as a vastly different title, to me, it sets the standard in video games for consistency in style and presentation. SMTV throws a lot of different elements in from a UI and art direction standpoint, and they don't always mesh well. A good example of this is the section in the school at the end of the first act, which has this really interesting visual style, but one which is completely different from the area you just explored in a style which never really gets visited again. A few of the later dungeons feel this way as well, like they were made separate from the rest of the experience and everything was just smashed together at the end. Overall, SMTV starts with this new sort of open experience but gets held back by not putting it all together cohesively as the game wears on. In the end, said open areas are the strongest point of the game because they feel the most distinct, but the rest of the experience doesn't support these sections well enough. That being said, I'm gonna kind of contradict everything I just said. It's time to talk about the second way in which I felt let down, why I don't enjoy the new direction as much as previous titles. To make things simpler, I'm just gonna pick one title. We're gonna focus on SMT4 since comparing it to stuff like Nocturne, Digital Devil Saga, or Persona 5 might make things a little bit harder to follow. You could probably make the comparison to any one of those and find SMTV wanting, but I'll try to keep it simple. The way SMT4 built atmosphere felt wholly unique and stood out drastically from other games in the genre. It started off in a completely foreign sort of world with anachronistic, word of the day, elements that implied something was off, eventually leading you back to the modern era, but one that's both recognizable and still completely foreign. Through music, interactions with NPC humans and demons, and following the main story path, you really grew to understand that game's version of Tokyo. You also grew to understand both the subtle and drastic ways in which it had changed. It felt like a believable world, and as such the factions inhabiting it felt more understandable. If a player understands the world, they'll understand the forces that want to change it, and it helps the main story even if said story isn't amazing by itself. In SMTV, it's just a wasteland. SMT4 had these pockets of civilization that served to greet the player and allow them into the world. These places would sometimes have both humans and demons hanging around, allowing you to see how society had adjusted. In SMTV, there's still demons around, and they're as weird as any SMT installment, but there's something a little bit off about them. Their eccentricities are there just to be there, whereas in SMT4 those eccentricities would reinforce or contrast part of the established world. The biggest weakness in the atmosphere of SMTV is there's nothing to establish. It feels empty in more ways than just its openness. At the end of the game, I didn't feel like I understood the world any more than I did at the start. The idea of these sort of post-apocalyptic desert areas is just not as interesting to me as seeing a more recognizable world populated with unrecognizable elements. I don't mind that they went in another direction for this installment. Like I said earlier, the unique aspects of SMTV are the parts that I like the most. But even at its best, I think the concept of a dead world is just significantly less interesting than a live one. Shin Megami Tensei 5 is a game that fell short of greatness, and it was sort of doomed from the start given the impossibly high bars set by Atlus over the past decade or so. I also haven't even mentioned up to this point that a significant portion of the game was developed during that one disease that YouTube likes to demonetize, which obviously helps explain a lot of the problems that I had. I'm not trying to make excuses for the game's flaws, but there is a wider context to view them in. Plenty of bad games enter and exit my brain without a second thought, but SMTV deserves credit for being good enough that it's stuck in my brain, pressing me to figure out why it just didn't work for me as well as it should have. And at least, even if I came away underwhelmed, I'll still have the cherished memories of Wiener Demons. Thanks for watching. Please let me know if you enjoy content like this so I can keep making it, and have a wonderful day.